Hello, I'm Niobe Wei. I'm a developmental psychology professor at New York University, and today we're going to be talking about the crisis of connection among adolescent boys. And this work comes from over 3 decades of work on boys' social and emotional development. And as a developmental psychologist, what I do in my research is I study boys longitudinally, so I follow them from early to late adolescence. So what I'm going to talk about today are the findings coming from boys' narratives from early to late adolescence. When you listen to young boys in early adolescence, they sound like this. This is Justin at the age of 14, and I'm going to read it now. He says, in response to a question about his close friendships, he says, "My best friend and I love each other. That's it. You have this thing that is deep, so deep it's within you, you can't explain it. It's just a thing that you know that that person is that person, and that is all that should be important in our friendship. I guess in life, sometimes two people can really understand each other and really have a trust, respect, and love for each other. It just happens. It's human nature." The next quote I'm going to read for you is Hector, who at the age of 14 as well said, in response to a question about his friendships, he says, "I've got 2 best friends, Willie and Brian. Like sometimes when me and Willie argue, me and Brian are real close. Then when me and Brian are not doing so good, me and Willie are real close. It's like circles of love. Sometimes we're all close." So Michael says, at the age 14 as well, he says, "My ideal best friend is a close friend who I could say anything to. Because sometimes you need to spill your heart out to somebody, and if there's nobody there, then you're going to keep it inside. Then you'll have anger, so you need somebody to talk to always." This is quite surprising in a context in which we frame boys as emotionally illiterate, as wanting independence and competition in their friendships, rather than wanting emotional intimacy. And yet, what we hear boys consistently, 85% of the hundreds and hundreds of boys I've interviewed over the past 30 years have repeated these themes of wanting and having, at times, these kinds of emotionally intimate friendships. Yet something begins to change as they get into late adolescence, and this is where we begin to hear the story of the crisis of connection. When boys transition into late adolescence, they start to sound very different than what they did in early adolescence. They start in many ways to sound like the gender stereotype. So let's listen to one boy at age 16. He says, when asked if he has friendships in his senior year of high school, he says, "No. I don't say I have a male best friend because I feel that a friend is going to be there for you, and he'll support you and stuff like that. Whether they're good and bad times, you can share with him. You could share your feelings with him, your true feelings. That's why I don't think I have any real close friends. Yeah, basically I hate it. I hate it because, you know, I wouldn't mind talking to somebody my age, that I can relate to him on a different basis." What you hear in that narrative is a desire, not only the expression of a desire for close friendship, but the frustration of not finding the kinds of friendships that he wants. Boys during late adolescence start to talk about losing their friendships, struggling to trust their friendships, struggling to maintain their friendships, in a ways that suggest that they are genuinely struggling and facing a crisis. They begin to say that they would like such friendships, but they don't have them. They also begin to say things like, "I don't care," whatever, when asked about their friendships, even though further in their narratives or in their interviews, they talk about actually wanting them, but covering them over with saying things like, "I don't care." So for example, you have a boy who at 14 years old will talk about his having a close friendship, the importance of sharing deep secrets with that friendships, and by the time he's in late adolescence, he'll say things like, "I'm not gay." In response to the very same question that we asked him previously. When asked if he has a close friendships, he'll say, "I'm not gay." So what boys basically begin to learn as they get into late adolescence is that wanting these friendships has now been framed as something that's girly or gay. I work with a group of middle school boys in New York City, and after the mass violence happened in Newtown, Connecticut, and I went into the classroom of 7th grade boys, and I asked them about why they thought that Adam Lanza committed this crime in terms of killing all these young people and teachers. And the boys paused for a moment and they said, "Because he's crazy." And I said to the boys, "Well, but the question is, why is he crazy? What made him crazy?" And 3 boys said in unison to me, they said, "Loneliness." And I said, looking at them, wondering how they were going to explain this. I said, what's the link between loneliness and violence? And then all of a sudden you had 24 boys raise their hand, wanting to tell their own stories about when they felt lonely, when they felt excluded, when they felt like they didn't have the friendships that they wanted. It made them angry, and this oftentimes made them feel violent in all sorts of ways. What you hear is boys directly linking loneliness and anger certainly can lead to all sorts of violence, including self-directed violence. So what boys teach us is that adolescence is actually a period not only of growth but also of loss, particularly the relationships that they hold so dear to their hearts. And what we hear among boys is that boys start to focus on who they are not during late adolescence. They are not childish, nor are they girls, nor in the case of straight boys are they gay. And they become obsessed with this idea that they need to prove their manhood. Boys, in other words, grow up to be stoic, autonomous, and lonely. And today what I want to talk about is, why should we care about this? Why should we care about the loss of relationships for boys in late adolescence, about the struggle to maintain social connections? And what is at the root of that? Why are we seeing that pattern? So the key question is, we heard about in the first section, we heard about the loss of friendships and the struggle to maintain good friendships for boys during adolescence. And now what I want to talk about is, why should we care about this loss? Why is this loss important? Why should we be paying urgent attention to it? And so let's talk about what we know about the importance of social connectedness. So first what I'm going to do is actually once again read from the boys, of what I've learned from boys during adolescence about the consequences of not having the friendships that they so want. Let's listen to what they sound like. One of the young men in my studies says, you need friends to talk to sometimes. You know, like you have nobody to talk to. You don't have a friend. It's hard. You got to keep things bottled up inside. You might just start crying or whatever. Another boy says, friendships are important because, like, you have problems with something, you go talk to him, you know. If you keep it all to yourself, you go crazy. You try to take it out on someone else. Another boy says, without friends, you will go crazy or mad. You'd be lonely all the time. You'd be depressed. You'd go wacko. And finally, a young man says, my friendships are important because you need a friend, or else you'd be depressed. You won't be happy. You'd try to kill yourself, because then you'd be all alone and no one to talk to. So what boys are telling us explicitly is that friendships are critical for mental health. And what you find when you look at the larger body of science, that in fact the larger body of science confirms exactly what boys are telling us directly, that friendships are critical not only for mental health, but as for physical health, for academic achievement, for having all sorts of positive outcomes. So let's talk about what we know from the science. In many, many books over the past 10, 15 years, there's an increasing entire body of research on the importance of social connectedness, the consequences of an increasingly lonely society. And in each of these books, and what you'll see on the screen, is approximately a dozen books that have been published even in the past decade, focusing on the fact that we are social animals. Humans are social animals that need each other to thrive. And I'll read a quote from one of the neuroscientists who did research on this topic. Matthew Lieberman says, quote, we are wired to be social. We are driven by deep motivations to stay connected to friends and family. We are naturally curious about what is going on in the minds of other people. We spend our entire lives motivated by social connection. And when we don't get social connection, there's all sorts of negative consequences. And again, I'm going to cite the research to let you know, what do we know about what happens when we don't have close social connections. For example, the research says adolescents without close friendships are at risk of depression, suicide, dropping out of school, early pregnancy, drug use, and gang membership. Furthermore, those who have close friendships or strong social support networks are less prone to depression, less likely to get physical illnesses, and more likely to live longer lives. Epidemiologists have reported that the two most important factors determining the health and well-being of people living in industrialized countries are social status and friendships. Furthermore, in a 6-year study of 736 middle-aged men, attachment to a single person, almost always a spouse, did not lower the risk of heart attack and fatal coronary heart disease, whereas having a strong social support network did. Smoking was the only risk factor comparable to a lack of social support. In addition, people with strong social support are less likely than others to get colds and other common illnesses, and as I said before, are at less risk of death. And all these studies are coming out. We've known this for about 20 to 30 years. These are coming from an array of over 100 studies that have shown the important impact of social support, friendships, good quality relationships on our mental and physical health. And we even find in research, which is just remarkable, we even find that wounds heal quicker when you are someone who's surrounded by good social support and has a strong social network. So in essence, all of this research on the connection between social connection and mental and physical health and all sorts of positive outcomes suggests that friendships and social support are not just feel-good issues, they're life and death issues. So now in this third section, we're going to focus on why do we have a crisis of connection? Why do we see boys struggle with their friendships during late adolescence? Why do they talk about not being able to find the friendships that they want during late adolescence? And the primary culprit, according to the boys themselves, has to do with an American culture that really focuses on the individual over relationships, and they privilege the sort of self over community. And there's all sorts of evidence of this. When we look, for example, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I'm very attuned to this. When we look, for example, at our notions of maturity, our notions of maturity are based on being self-sufficient, being able to do things on your own, not needing others. And in fact, what message we give when we give young people that message that that's the definition of maturity is that we're really privileging the self over the relationships. So what boys will say is that I'm old enough, thus I don't need to share my feelings. So what boys learn is that becoming mature is actually becoming more isolated. The second way we see this focus on individualism is the way we define success and think about success and talk about success. So if we look at a person like Steve Jobs, who built Apple, the focus is almost always on Steve Jobs as an individual. When in fact you listen to Steve Jobs talk about building Apple and building that company, he's always talking about the partners he built it with. He's talking about Steve Wozniak, he's talking about all sorts of collaborators that helped him build the company, but yet somehow we still go back to the fact that Apple must be the success of an individual. And that again underscores our individual focus. What communicates to boys is this idea that it's the individual that matters. You also see this individualism in the image of the American cowboy, the icon of maturity, but also of manhood. And so we communicate to our boys with those images that, again, what's important is being able to be out on your own and not needing others and not needing relationships. The other way in which we hear that in American culture is through our norms of masculinity. And that's obviously a story that's playing out throughout these narratives. You hear it in the boys saying explicitly, I don't need close friendships, I'm not gay. You hear them talk about needing to man up. You hear them talk about needing to not be emotionally expressive. One of the boys in my studies said, it might be nice to be a girl because then I wouldn't have to be emotionless. And that statement should give everybody pause. The idea that we're raising boys to think that in order to be a man you have to be emotionless is deeply troubling, and in fact really lies at the root of why these boys are struggling so much to maintain their connections. Because what they realize, and this is the most remarkable thing to hear this from boys themselves, is that their natural emotional acuity, their natural need for relationships begins to be pathologized. It begins to be seen as weak, as something that that real men don't have. When in fact what we know from all the research is real men need them, they want them, they have them in many cases, but they struggle to maintain them. So these kinds of messages that we give to our boys really needs to change. The question comes at this point when we have a better understanding of the crisis of connection, why we should care about the crisis of connection, and what's underlying the crisis of connection, what's causing this crisis of connection. We arrive at the question of what would it mean to allow our boys to be boys by encouraging and fostering their emotional acuity, their friendships, their ability to read the emotional world, the human world. What would it mean to value the very things that we stereotype as girly and gay? What would it mean if we actually understood that having emotionally intimate friendships is not just a girl thing, it's not just a gay thing, it's not just a childish thing, it's a human thing, and that humans need that. So now that we understand the crisis of connection, why we should care about the crisis of connection, what underlies the crisis of connection, the next and final part I want to talk about is what can we do about it? How can we address the crisis of connection to help boys have better friendships and better relationships? And the first thing I have to say is we have to make it public that this is normal, that boys' desire for close friendships, that boys' desire for emotionally intimate relationships with boys and girls is normal. It's a normal thing for boys to want. And so I've had many examples in which I go into classrooms with teenage boys and I begin to talk about my findings. And usually when I start talking about those findings about boys talking about how much they love their best friend and how much they can't live without them, there's always oftentimes giggles in the classroom. And then when I've asked in a recent 7th grade classroom, I said to the boys, "Why are you laughing?" And the boys said, "Well, the dude sounds gay." And so my response to them was to say, well, in fact, I don't know the sexuality of this particular boy, but let me tell you that 85% of all the boys I've ever interviewed over 30 years sound like this at some time during adolescence. And the boys looked at me with their mouth slightly agape, and they said, "For real?" And then I said, yes, in fact, that's what I find in my research, that at that moment, the minute they heard that it was normal, the boys all started to want to share their own stories of friendships and their own love for particular boys in the classroom or the ways in which they wanted to have friendships. 2 boys even talked about how they had fallen out in their friendship and how it made them both sad. They were both in the classroom together. And so it became obvious to me at that point that it's easy to let boys know that this is normal desire. It's a normal part of just simply being human. The second thing that we have to value is we have to value the emotional acuity of boys. They are remarkably emotionally intelligent. They say things, they notice things, they see the human world, they see the emotional world, and if you listen carefully, they say remarkable things. For example, the classroom full of boys who said that the root of the mass murder by Adam Lanza in Newtown, Connecticut, had to do with loneliness. And they saw it immediately. While the mass culture was focusing only on guns, and certainly guns is a huge part of the equation, but they also noted something else that not many people were talking about, which is loneliness. And that leads to the third thing that we have to do, which is we have to stop ignoring boys' loneliness. And we oftentimes, as a culture, we frame these boys as loners. We think they're just loners, they don't want friendships. Very few boys are loners, actually. Very few boys actually don't want friendships. Most boys do. When boys communicate to counselors, to their physicians, to their parents, to their friends, that they feel lonely or that they're feeling frustrated, that they can't find the friendships that they want, we need to take that seriously. We need to think about how to help boys have those relationships. And there's all sorts of strategies we can use to helping them join different activity groups, helping them join after-school activities, helping them have good friendships. But we really need to take that desire seriously when boys express it. The final sort of overarching strategy we need to think about is really engaging constantly in challenging stereotypes about boys, about girls included. So we have these stereotypes in our culture that boys are thinkers and not feelers, and girls are feelers and not thinkers. Well, that's simply not the case. We know that from research, and we also know that from our own children. That these are, thinking and feeling is simply a human thing. We all have extraordinary capacity for thinking and feeling. So we really need to be challenging those stereotypes, showing our children that they're not true. So my studies have always included very ethnically and racially diverse samples. So my studies include Black and Puerto Rican and Dominican and Chinese American and white European, Eastern European, etc. I have all sorts of boys represented across social class. And the interesting thing are two things. One is that there's a remarkable similarity across all these boys because they're all raised in the same American culture. And so the loss that I talk about so much, you hear that across social class, across race, across ethnicity. The difference is interestingly enough, you hear that boys raised in communities where relationships and emotional acuity is more valued, for example, in a lot of Latino communities, where that is really a core part of what it means to be a Puerto Rican young man, for example, is being emotionally astute and connected to their community. Of the boys who are able to maintain their friendships and continue to have positive, emotionally intimate friendships, it's oftentimes the boys coming from such communities. And so of course there's variability in the loss. Not all boys lose their friendships, not all boys struggle to hold on to their friendships. There's always variability in any kind of sample. But the variability we see really seems to correspond with the young men who come from communities in which they really are valuing community more than some other boys. And particularly in my samples, you hear that from the Puerto Rican boys in particular. A lot of my studies are done in New York, Boston, the East Coast, where the Puerto Rican communities are very tight-knit, and so that you really hear this strong sort of ability to hold on to the relationships through adolescence. But you still hear the loss too. So interestingly enough, so you have lots of examples of boys hanging out that's not necessarily healthy hanging out. And so one of the things I try to make very clear based on what the boys have told me directly is when I say boys need friendships, I don't mean any friendships. I don't mean they just need anybody to hang out with. I mean that they need healthy relationships. They need mutually supportive relationships. And according to the boys, that means being able to be vulnerable with each other, being able to share secrets with each other, not being laughed at when you feel vulnerable. And all those kinds of things are not actually typical of many boy groups. So gangs, for example, oftentimes people say, well, young men join gangs because they're looking for family. Well, that's oftentimes the case. But the kind of support they're getting oftentimes in particularly violent gangs is not the kind of support that boys are talking about wanting. They are really explicitly talking about wanting to be able to be vulnerable with another young man, be cared for in that way, in ways that allows them to feel very close. And I think it's important in our culture when we sort of talk about, you know, bromance or all sorts of ways we say, oh, boys don't have any problems with that. There's gangs, there's fraternities, there's all sorts of male groups coming together. But for the most part, when you talk to young men in those contexts, they are not having the relationships they want. They tell you that explicitly. They're not finding the close friendships that they want. And if they are, it's oftentimes, right, some kind of context. It's not in where they're engaged in negative behavior. It's some kind of fraternity or sports team where the coach, for example, is really fostering the relationships among the team players. In a fraternity or in any kind of boys' activities where boys are together, if the leader or the coach or the faith leader is encouraging relationships, then you see boys really finding the friendships that they want. So a lot of it is really, you know, making clear that we're not just talking about anybody, but boys hanging out with anybody. We're really talking about boys finding the relationships that they most want and that they tell us that they most want. So the interesting thing about teen parents is what we learned from listening to teen mothers as well as teen fathers, and I did a book on teen mothers a long time ago where we followed them over 6 years, is that parents, teenagers, in their looking for connection, oftentimes see having children as a possibility of having the kind of connection they're seeking. So you hear lots of young women and men talk about the desire for connection, the desire to have a child, to really connect. Young men will talk about wanting to have a child to be the father that their father never was, wanting to have that kind of connection with another human being, a son or a daughter. I mean, it really is, if you understand teen parenting within the framework of young people really looking for connection, deep connection, that you understand more why they might choose to have a child with the hopes that they can have the kind of relationship with their children that they're perhaps not having in their schools or with their peers or at home, etc. So I think it's a critical issue to think about what are the strategies that young people use to seek that connection. And if they're not properly guided by a loving adult, a loving peer, a loving leader in the community, oftentimes they make choices to find connection in not so great places. So they'll choose to have a baby when they're 15 or 16, when in fact if they were surrounded by a loving community, would provide them opportunities for connection that didn't entail having a baby at 15 or 16, and the same is true for teenage fathers too. And so when you find them, when you offer them the guidance, the scaffolding, so to speak, in terms of making choices of how to find good connections, then you see that young people make good choices. But we have to offer them the opportunities. We have to offer them the possibilities to find these connections. The good news that we know from early adolescence that boys have remarkable emotional acuity, that they are able to express what they want, what they need to thrive. And so I think, we take that good news that boys actually, we don't have to teach it to them. We don't have to, give them a curriculum on it, that they naturally have it. You see that in the work with young boys too, in Judy Chu's work. You see that at 4- and 5-year-old boys also have that remarkable emotional acuity and astuteness. And so our challenge then is not to have to teach it to boys, but to actually nurture it. And that's a much easier task to try to nourish it than to try to teach something that's fundamentally human. So the good news in some ways, a lot of people say that my research is depressing because it talks about the loss. But I always think, no, it's the opposite. It's incredibly hopeful because what it shows is that boys have the capacity, the interest, the ability to talk about what they want and need the most. And we need to listen to them carefully and nurture that capacity. And that's easy to do. It's easy to do. So the good news is that boys already have what they need to thrive, and now it's up to us to actually nurture it. So what I say to all healthcare professionals, social workers, community leaders, all people who work with youth, I say the same thing. We have to begin to challenge our obsessive focus on the individual as understanding someone's problems. So as long as we treat them as if what's going wrong in their life is simply a matter of them making bad choices, we don't really get at the root of the problem. We need to see them as part of a community, part of a set of relationships, and thus treat them in that way. So when we understand that a young person is, for example, engaging in risky behavior, taking drugs, using alcohol, engaging in violence, etc., we need to see them as not a separate individual and sort of understand why they're making bad choices. They certainly are making bad choices, but to understand, as the boys always tell me, why are they making bad choices? And almost always it goes back to the same story, which is that they're trying to seek out connection. They're trying to feel connected to themselves and others, and when they're not being provided the scaffolding to be able to do that in a healthy fashion, they make bad choices. So yes, they are making bad choices, but we need to see them as, how do we help them find the relational needs they want? How do we we help build their own communities so that they're stronger and more connected, so they won't make bad choices, rather than lecturing them, which parents often do, but professionals sometimes do as well, lecturing our children and our clients that they're just simply making bad choices. We need to start helping them find solutions through building community. So what I would want to do is have the medical professional basically engage with the young person about how they're doing, not just how they're doing in terms of whether they're doing well in school, or I'm thinking about all the questions that pediatricians oftentimes ask their adolescent clients or patients, is that really finding out how their friendships are, whether they're having the friendships that they want, having a list of resources of kinds of activities, kinds of after-school activities that young people could do, figuring out ways to help young people find the relationships that they want, but really checking in with young people around those topics. So you're communicating, when you check in as a pediatrician or as a social worker, you're communicating to the other person, to the person you're meeting with, that the relationships matter and that you care about the relationships. So ask them about how are things going at home in your school with your friends, how are things going on at home with your relationships with your mom and your dad or whomever the child is living with, and really making it clear that that's as important as asking if you smoke or not, or if you engage in alcohol, or all the kinds of questions that young people are always asked when they enter into a healthcare facility. But really focusing on the relationships, and then thinking about when the child says, I don't have the friendships I want, I feel kind of lonely, sometimes it makes me sad, which a lot of young people tell me in our interviews. Having resources to sort of think about how to connect them to different organizations, to different groups, sometimes religiously based, sometimes sports based, depending on what the interest of the child is. And so really communicating again through your conversation with them that this is valuable. So for parents, I think, first of all, we have to start young. We have to start when our children are babies, in terms of the way we communicate to them, the way we show them what we value. So that means helping them have, when they're younger, helping them have good friendships, good peer relationships. When they get bullied, when they're perhaps bullying other children, we take that seriously. We talk about it not as in a defensive mode if our children happen to be the bullies, but actually in a way of thinking about, why is my child feeling like it's necessary to bully another child? You know, what can I do to help him feel more connected so he doesn't feel like he has to bully someone to be liked by other kids? Oftentimes kids will tell me directly they bully because they're hoping that that will make them popular. And so the idea is, but root is, right, their desire for connection. They want to be connected to other kids, and they're using the wrong strategies to try to do that. So it's really having discussions about these things at the dinner table, in the car when you're driving home with your child, at nighttime if you put them to bed, starting from a very early age. And I even, as a parent, I have a parent of a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, I even talk about my own friendships with my children, not the inner details, but I talk about the conflicts I have with my friends so that they understand that friendships also take work. There can be conflict. This is how you can work through a conflict. I mean, really not only helping our children have friendships, but maintain those friendships. What does it mean when your friend does something really mean to you? How should you handle that? What should you say? And really having spaces in your home that your children can talk about that. And if they don't want to talk about it with you, which a lot of teenagers don't want to talk to their parents about that, then figuring out ways that they can bring their friends over to be able to talk about it. Inviting the young people over to spend the night at your house, or allowing them to go spend the night at somebody else's house. Or when you go on a family trip, allowing one of the friends of your children to come along with you, even though many parents don't want that because they feel like it takes away from their time with their children. But invest in that relationship. Figure out opportunities that you can do with the child so that their friendships are really nourished. And so if you start that at a very young age, then it becomes much easier in adolescence, when it can be a tougher time in terms of communication, that your sons and daughters will make good choices. Because ultimately as parents, I've decided, after being a parent of teenagers now, and all my research, that it's really about helping our children make good choices. And how do we help them make good choices? By actually allowing them their full humanity to flourish, their full, emotional capacity to flourish, and that allows them to make better choices than children who are restricted to not feeling, not crying, not expressing things that are more sensitive and vulnerable. That really shuts down their humanity.